Welcome to Lecture 4, The Empire Strikes Back, which is going to lay out the origins of the American Revolution. Our story actually starts with a war that seemed to be good in terms of its outcomes for Britain. And that war begins in the interior of the United States, otherwise known as the back country. By that we mean Ohio, the frontiers of Pennsylvania, North Carolina, everything past the Appalachian Mountains. In the 1750s, the back country is swarming with squatters, people who are illegally settled there, Scots-Irish settlers, French traders, and they're all trying to get access to the resources of these areas and to control the Indians who are there. The Indians who are in this backcountry, the numerous tribes that are there, are constantly trying to play off British and French settlers against each other in order to keep, the British and the French from gaining too much power over these western lands. And so you will find Indians who ally with the British, Indians who ally with the French, Indians who shift alliances, Indians who pretend to ally with one and but actually are really allied with the other. So there's a whole lot of jockeying for power over this area past the mountains, the Appalachian Mountains. One other group really wants control of this property, and they're land speculators from Virginia and Pennsylvania. They've got their eyes on the Ohio River Valley, interested in all these fertile territories which could be settled by people and be made into profitable farms. So these land speculators want to buy this land up quickly, and then try to sell it and make some money off of it. Also, all these groups want something in this Ohio River Valley, and they're willing to fight to get what they want. Well, that breaks out into war in 1754, the First World War in some ways. It's known as the French and Indian War in America, or the 7 Years' War in Europe. Starts in America, spreads to Europe, even spreads as far as India, which is why some scholars think of it as a world war. In colonial America, it's the British versus the French who are allied with the Indians, because most of the Indians, a good deal of them, are, if not neutral, are going to pick the French side because the French usually treat them much more nicely. Because the American colonists have an interest in this land and an interest in winning this war, they hold some debates and discussions in 1754 to figure out how they're going to handle the conflict. They meet in Albany, New York, and in Albany, New York, there's a proposal to unite all of the colonies in the war effort. So the colonies would share the fighting, share the governance, share control over these western lands. And this attempt to unite the colonies actually ends up being a failure in the long run, because none of the colonies want to work with any of the other colonies. There's a lot of fear the colonists have of giving up control to a more centralized power. And that should tell you something about politics in colonial America. There's a deep fear of being controlled by a central governing authority. Well, the war comes to an end in 1760, and it's victorious for the British, who are suddenly facing the fact that they control all of North America except for the parts controlled by Spain. And they now have all of these French possessions all across the world because France is defeated. With the French now gone, Indians have one playoff partner out of the way and now can only work with the British. And that, of course, makes it more difficult for the Indians to exploit groups against each other. But from the British point of view, the war has a much more important consequence, and that is immense debt. It was 58 million pounds. I realize that just looks like 58 pounds. It really should just be million pounds. If you put that in today's money, it would be $10 trillion. This is an extremely expensive war for the British. So their victory was costly. And the question is, where are they going to get that money from? Here's a map of the back country. You can see all the English settlers are on the coast, on the side here, and then just beyond the Appalachian Mountains, you've got all of these lands that the French believe belong to them, the British believe that belong to them. Land speculators want to take over and sell these lands. You've got Indians who are saying, we don't want anyone in this land, we want to keep this for ourselves. And so there are a number of forts here where the British are trying to establish control over the territory. You see just how much the French have influence in the territory. This string of French forts is basically in today what would be Pennsylvania. In the Albany Congress of 1754, Benjamin Franklin proposed the idea that the colonies unite and join together. And in an attempt to convince the colonists to work together, he printed this cartoon, which is regarded as one of the earliest political cartoons printed in a newspaper in America, with the message to suggest that if the colonies do not unite, they will die. Unfortunately for Franklin, at the Albany Conference, the colonists had no interest in uniting together to form a united government. Here is the forks of the Ohio near present-day Pittsburgh, which is where the war between France and Britain broke out. Actually started by George Washington when his party of colonials and Indians happened upon a French encampment, and then they slaughtered the French, including the commander, the French commander. So it's a war that transforms the relationship of Britain to its colonies. The debt, as we mentioned on the previous slide, is immense and staggering. Britain has to figure out how to pay for it. But the other interesting development has come from the fact that the British spent a lot of time in America during this war, and they observed Americans close up. And their impression of Americans is not very flattering. They think Americans are wealthy and independent and greedy and selfish. They think Americans don't understand what real hardship is like, that Americans have life far too easy. Americans have a different impression of the war. They come out of the war thinking, gosh, we so helped win this. We are proud of ourselves. Go America. We did a good job. So you've got two sides with different views of each other at the end of the war, and an immense debt. In the Treaty of Paris that ended this war, the western lands that belonged to the Indians were transferred to the British without asking the Indians if, this was a good thing or not. The French just simply gave it away. And so the British take over all of the western forts and move to push the French out and take over trade with the Indians. That triggers another war called Pontiacs War, 1763. Pontiac gets really tired of the British, very tired of the British disregard for Indian diplomacy and the ways that Indians meet and discuss with other countries, trade, and all the sorts of things that happen in their diplomacy. The fact that the British are doing very little to control people taking Indian lands and settling on those Indian lands. So Pontiac just has enough. He's tired and angry. He launches a series of attacks on British forts, and he's quite successful at harassing the British, but never defeating them. The British walk away from this war convinced that the colonists cannot be allowed to go west. They think that wherever colonists go, they stir up conflict with the Indians, then the British have to show up and put that conflict down, and that costs money. Remember, Britain's in deep debt, 58 million pounds. So any expense is seen as a wasteful expense. So Pontiac's War takes the results of the French and Indian War and makes the situation even worse in Ohio and the backcountry. The British response to all of this is to decide that white American colonists cannot be allowed to move past the Appalachian Mountains. So they pass a proclamation of 1763, the British do, and it tells colonists, you cannot set foot beyond the Appalachian Mountains. And now the colonists are suddenly being denied all of this land that they won in a war. All the speculators are angry that all of their efforts at making money off of these nice, beautiful western lands is now gone down the drain. And colonists get incredibly angry. So a war that was very positive initially is now souring as the Americans are getting more and more irritated at how the British are handling the aftermath. So these maps show the Proclamation of Line of 1763 as well as Western settlement. So here's the line drawn on the map. Colonists are told you got to stay on this side of the line. You can't go over to these lovely, luscious western lands and then try to sell them and make money because you'll stir up too much trouble with the Indians. Now, interestingly enough, settlement in the West is pretty limited, even up to 1760. There are very few people settled past the Appalachian Mountains anyway. But wherever white people do show up over here in the West, they typically tend to cause trouble with the Indians. And so the British would rather keep them on the other side of the line, over here on the coast. That's not the only frontier chaos, Pontiac's Rebellion, that happens in the 1760s. In fact, there's a whole wave of frontier violence in the 1760s as colonists are feeling anxious and feeling pent up and trapped in these frontier communities and not being able to help or govern themselves effectively. So throughout 1763 to 1770, there's actually a whole wave of violence that occurs on the frontier. Much of it is for the same reason that rebels took off in Bacon's Rebellion. They felt ignored by Eastern elites. They felt unprotected by the people who lived in the East. A good example of this would be the Paxton Boys, who in 1764 attack the Quaker leaders of Pennsylvania, demanding more protection from Indian attacks on the frontier. They demand that the Quakers spend more money on forts and defense for the West. They threatened to actually attack Philadelphia and burn it to the ground, but Benjamin Franklin manages to talk them out of it. Another one that happens in North and South Carolina is the Regulator Rebellions. These are Western settlers who in North and South Carolina feel like they're being abused and mistreated, that they have a lack of justice, they have a lack of political power, and they would like to see themselves treated more fairly on the frontier. So Pontiac's Rebellion and actually other rebellions form a wave of frontier violence in the 1760s. Violence is also going to take off by the mid-1760s, when the British are going to decide that they are going to get money out of the colonies to pay the war debt, no matter what ridiculous means they use to do it. And their first ridiculous means is via the Stamp Act. In 1765, the British tax paper in colonial America, and colonists get together to condemn this Stamp Act, saying that it's unconstitutional because it's a tax with no representation given to the colonies to decide if they have the desire for this tax or not. So they mean taxed without their permission, without their consent. Colonists, eager to show the British just how much they don't want to be mistreated and taxed, form a vigilante street organization known as the Sons of Liberty. The Sons of Liberty will actually use violence against stamp distributors in order to get those stamp distributors to resign. So if I said that I was going to sell these stamps, that the British say I have to buy in order to use paper goods, I could get a visit from my local Sons of Liberty who might threaten to break my kneecaps or tar and feather me if I don't quit my job. One other tool that the Sons of Liberty call for is the use of non-importation or a boycott of British goods. In order to convince the British that the colonists mean business and to punish the British merchants, Americans agree to not buy any products from Britain. So they're going to use this boycott to make a political statement. And British merchants are going to suffer, and when they suffer because they're not making money, they will intervene and ask Parliament to get rid of the Stamp Act. How successful was the boycott? American purchases of goods had increased from 1750 to 1763 by 120%. So Americans are buying British goods in large numbers, and it's growing every year. So a boycott like this in a single year does hurt a British merchant, and it does make them feel the pain of colonists not buying. Interestingly enough, this resistance also gave women a chance to be political. Women could show their sympathies for American values and American beliefs by also not buying British goods. So a woman who, doesn't go out and buy a new piece of cloth in order to make a beautiful, lovely new dress can say she supports America and she's not spending her hard-earned money on English frivolities. Ultimately, it's successful. In 1766, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act, but also, just to be spiteful, said that the British Parliament reserved the right to legislate in all cases for the colonies. The translation of that is, we will tax you whenever we darn feel like it. You can see here one of the ways the colonists threatened colonial British officials. You might do an effigy of them, like a mock-up, a dummy mock-up of the person, dress it in that person's clothes, give it like a pumpkin head or something like that, and then you might burn it, or you might hang it, as if to say, look, we will come after you, the real person, and do exactly to you what we just did to this effigy if you don't back off of these horrible British policies. How many protests were there against the Stamp Act? A lot. All of the dots here on this map show protests breaking out up and down the Atlantic coast. And notice that the protests really roughly are limited to seaport towns, places where the stamps would come into the port, be taken off a boat, and be delivered to the stamp master to sell so people could buy them. Interestingly enough, the colonies develop a lot of anti-Stamp Act propaganda and a lot of Stamp Act ideas that are against the Stamp Act in non-written form, such as this teapot, which was made in England and was designed to celebrate with the colonists the repeal of the Stamp Act and their opposition to that Stamp Act. So how ironic is that, buying an English teapot to show your displeasure at English policies and English politics? Interestingly enough, this teapot was also part of the document-based question on the 2017 exam. Here is what one of the stamps would have looked like. You would have had to put it on playing cards, wills, newspapers, anything that required paper. So that, paying the tax by buying the paper would generate some money for the English crown, or at least that was the hope. I love this cartoon. In the good tradition of all English cartoons in this time period, it features a lot of text and labels. So you have to get real close on it to see what all the symbolism is for. But like every good cartoon in this time period, pretty much tells you what it's for. Notice we've got a coffin containing the Stamp Act. Oh, poor Stamp Act. Poor little baby law. We've got a tomb for bad acts down here where all other bad British laws are going to go. And we've got goods now shipped for America to say that once the British repeal the Stamp Act, Americans will start buying British products again. And then my favorite element, as in all good 18th century cartoons, a dog peeing on someone's leg. Gotta be there. Well, the British, you would think, would have learned a lesson. Gee, colonists don't like being taxed without their permission. Got it. Check. But they didn't. In 1767, the British imposed a series of new taxes on tea, paper, glass, lead, and paint, with the goal of raising enough money to pay the salaries of all governors and judges in the colonies, meaning governors and judges wouldn't depend on the colonies for their salary now. It would come directly out of the taxes. Ooh, that's kind of scary, because withholding your governor's salary is one way you can keep your governor from causing you trouble. Eventually, all of these duties are repealed except for the tea tax, because colonists by now are angry about paying any kind of tax whatsoever. They've been stirred up to be anti-tax. And now they're anti-tax. In 1768, the state, or the colony of Massachusetts, not state yet because we're not statehood yet, published a letter which denounced these taxes, saying that they were antithetical, that they were opposed to the British legal traditions and the rights of all colonists. But the colonists did more than just write about how they didn't like these taxes. They also restarted the idea of not buying British. Don't buy any British goods as long as the British are attempting to tax the Americas. What this Townshend duty series of debacles eventually created was a debate over representation. It's one thing to reject taxes and say you don't like taxes because they're unfair, or they're heavy, or they're bad, or you don't have a right to voice your opinion on them. But it's another thing to debate the role of the colonists in the British government. And that's exactly what starts to happen here in the late 1760s. Colonists are making a distinction between external and internal taxes. External meaning it was imposed on us from outside. Direct meaning its sole purpose is to tax us. That is, it's not a hidden tax or a tax as a cost of, buying and shipping goods across the Atlantic, but solely and entirely for the purpose of raising money. And the debate over these kinds of taxes and whether they're right or wrong, whether they're appropriate for America or not, leads colonists to ask the question, why aren't we represented in Parliament? Why don't the colonies have a seat in the British government to say, here's what the colonies think about all these issues? So we start to see a debate about the nature of taxation, the nature of representation, and the colonists are told by the British, look, you're not really represented in Parliament, but you're virtually represented, and that's okay. That's good enough. So what the heck is virtual representation? Virtual, for the British, meant that the colonists had someone in Parliament who spoke for them, because all members of Parliament speak for everybody in the British world. That's right. You don't need your own representative because somebody in the British government probably already speaks for you and your identity as a British person. Virtual representation is okay. For the next few years, there's a little bit of calm. There's a tiny little blip of violence that happens in 1770, known as the Boston Massacre. It never really goes anywhere, never really arouses like a long-scale or large-scale rebellion. 5 colonists are killed by British soldiers, so it's actually hardly even a massacre. 5 people die. That's not a massacre by any stretch of the imagination. And really, honestly, the colonists started it by throwing rocks and snowballs at the British soldiers. So the British end up really coming out of this okay, despite colonists' attempt to stir up the event against Britain. So the propaganda made about the Boston Massacre eventually does no real good in stirring the colonists up. So just keep that in mind. You hear a lot about the Boston Massacre. People talk about it a lot. You can visit where all this happened in Boston. But really and truly, this is not one of the defining moments, because no political hay is made from it. No political drama results from it. People are like, okay, it was bad, but we're going to leave this alone. So we have here the very famous engraving by Paul Revere, designed to stir up the colonists with their hate for the British over the Boston Massacre. It's not successful. I mean, Paul Revere's got all these colonists gushing with blood, but really only 5 of them die. These guys are painted to look evil, but really it's self-defense. So as much as this is supposed to be super exciting and stir people up, it really doesn't work. It's more really a lie than it is truthful. Paul continued to try to stir people up in their hatred of the British by the second engraving that he had published in 1768, which was to illustrate the British Army landing in Boston. Paul Revere, was attempting to kind of shock people about the arrival of these British troops. So this long line of British soldiers here, almost an invasion of the city, so to speak. And it's sort of like Paul Revere's life. He spent a lot of time stirring people up to things that he was exaggerating quite a bit. Now it's a lovely chart here showing exports from England and Scotland to the colonies, starting in 1766, the year after the Stamp Act, and going through 1775. It's in pounds sterling, so you don't really need to know what that means. Just look at the numbers and think about, do they go up or do they go down? Notice they go dramatically down after the Townshend duties, but they go right back up, and then they even soar dramatically the year after that. This is amazing expenditures by the colonists, who were just so hungry for British goods, that Anglicization. You see, it does drop off. New York shows a very similar pattern. After we've got the Townshend duties, they enact the boycott, the non-importation agreements, but then the colonists are right back up again, spending money that they don't even have. Now, what's driving the colonists to act this way? Is it they just hate taxes? In some ways, I think yes. They actually just don't want to pay taxes. Somewhere at the heart of this, there are just a lot of people who are thinking, look, I'd like to keep that money for me. Now, they do have a rationale, a reason for why they feel the way they do, and we can trace that to a series of ideas that develop in the 1720s and 30s, known collectively as Enlightenment ideas. One of those is deism, the idea that God is a rational creator who operates the universe by natural law and not by meddling himself in human affairs. He's at a distance, just letting everything run on its own. So the colonists believe a lot in these natural laws, and they think the world should operate that way and people shouldn't interfere with them. From the Enlightenment ideas, not only do they learn about natural law, they learn about the belief that monarchy is an irrational, nonsensical form of government, and that governments really exist for the benefit of the people that they govern. And that's an important area of the colonists' thinking here, that government is for their benefit and not for the benefit of the government itself. Particularly, the colonists are animated by a series of 3 rights that they really cherish and hold on to. We get them from John Locke, and they are the natural rights of life, liberty, and property. So yes, you don't like paying taxes, but taxes take from your property. They take from what you've worked and earned. And the colonists are like, I don't want to give up that money. And if I'm being taxed without my consent, that's a loss of my liberty. That's a loss of my freedom. So how can I live a good, wonderful life if I don't have a voice in making my own laws and deciding when I pay taxes? From another Enlightenment philosopher, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, they get the idea of a social contract. The people give up rights in order for their rights to be protected by a government. But in order to get your rights protected, you have to give up some of your freedoms in order to get the protection of the government. And then there's a whole cluster of ideas that come out of what's called republicanism. Republicanism is the belief that a government can be easily corrupted by a monarch. Executive power, monarchs, presidents, the head honcho can corrupt governments very easily by buying influence, buying friends, buying his way into people's lives so that they owe him and they'll do anything he wants because he's, essentially bought them. Another fear that republicanism gives to the colonists is a fear of standing armies. You should never have an army that's permanent, because a permanent army is an easy tool for taking away the freedoms of the people in a government. And a third idea that's really crucial for the colonists is that you need to have virtue or an active participation in your society to defend your liberties. You can't be lazy or complacent about your liberties. You've got to actively stand up and get involved, be counted, in order to show that you have virtue. So it's not virtue like church virtue, where you're just a good person. This means active civic involvement. Together, these ideas help create a conspiratorial mindset against the British. So the British are off tinkering in England with laws to tax the colonists. The colonists are nationally suspicious. What's going on over there? What are they passing? What are they up to? What are they doing? Are they corrupting our government? Are they, raising a standing army? Are they plotting to take away our life, liberty, and property? So the colonists become almost paranoid about the British government and what the British are up to in the 1760s. I think the standpoint of the colonies can be really well illustrated by this cartoon. This is a great cartoon showing the colonists defending themselves against Britain. The colonists are the bare-breasted Indian woman on the right. Britain is the really super fancy woman on the left. And Britain is selling the colonists, "I'll force you to obedience, you rebellious slut." And the colonies are responding, "Liberty, liberty forever, mother, while I exist." So it's an interesting little metaphor of a mother-daughter squabble that's going on in America. But things are about to boil over even more terribly than they were before, in the form of tea, pun intended. Bubble over yet? Oh, yes, I know. It's terrible. 1773, the English Parliament passes the Tea Act, which grants a monopoly to a company to sell tea in the colonies at a lower price than they were paying before. So there is a tax on tea, or a tea duty, and the colonies have to pay it. It's just a lower amount than it was. And the colonists look at it and go, it's a trap. What the British are trying to do is to get us to buy tea at the lower rate and just therefore admit that we're okay being taxed. If we buy into this, we're just admitting that the tax is okay, and all we really care about is the price. Because this was a monopoly given to the East India Tea Company, it also seemed unfair that the colonies are basically having to deal with one company. They don't get freedom of choice here. So colonists, in their conspiratorial mindset, see this as the beginning of the end of their liberties, slowly seeing their freedoms being taken away from them with a cup of tea. So how do you respond to that? Well, in December of 1773, a group of Bostonians dressed as Indians climbed on board a ship and destroyed 11,000 pounds of tea, which is about $1.7 million today, by throwing it overboard into the Boston Harbor, making the world's largest cup of Earl Grey. So why tea? What's the deal with tea? Well, everybody drinks tea. If you've ever been to England, tea time is incredibly important. So it's a civilized moment in the afternoon where you have some pastries and a nice pot of tea. You need, in America and Britain, you need the right tools to do the tea thing, the tea service thing. So you've got to have the right dishes and the right cups. Tea is a status symbol. Everybody drinks it if they can afford it. So tea is everywhere in American life, and that's why it's seen as a trap. The British are seen as taxing something that everybody, makes a part of their lives. So how do you punish the British? Well, maybe you go and grab the local tea seller and you tar and feather him, to show the people in Boston and everywhere else that you won't tolerate the British taxing your tea. And maybe, just for good measure, you shove a nice bit of hot tea down his throat. Notice in the background of this particular illustration, we have guys throwing tea overboard. So it's a suggestion of the Boston Tea Party. This cartoon actually was done to make fun of the colonists. It was printed in Britain in 1774. Just how much did the colonists actually hold everybody to the no drinking of tea, no buying of British goods? Well, if you crossed that line, you were often visited by the Sons of Liberty, who would basically threaten your life if you did not put out a public statement saying you were sorry for going against the wishes of the community and buying tea or drinking tea or buying British goods. And so here poor Simeon Coley in 1769 is being forced to admit publicly that he violated the no British, the boycott of British goods, and that he sacrificed the public good for his own life, and he's so sorry that he did that. Here's an illustration of the Boston Tea Party. This is one of the earliest illustrations of the Tea Party to show up in the years after the American Revolution. Boston's not the only Tea Party. A patriotic society of ladies in Edenton, North Carolina, decide they're going to have their own tea party where they're all going to sign a piece of paper to say, we're not drinking tea anymore. This cartoon also makes fun of the ladies because it's printed from a British publication. So lady number one is getting a little bit of hello from this guy. And that's to suggest maybe she's not as virtuous as you might think. Maybe she's not a good woman after all, since this unknown gentleman here is being rather invasive. This woman here, the leader of this tea party, is shown to be so ugly that she's hardly even a woman. So you can attack a woman's virtue. You can also attack her beauty to suggest that she's not even a woman anymore. And even more, just put a child on the ground and have a dog peeing on things, which suggests that these are not even good mothers. So they're not pretty, they don't have virtue, they're not good moms. So clearly this cartoonist doesn't think much of the Edenton Tea Party. And now for a song. So we'll sing this whole thing in class and all the verses, but I'll just remind you of the tune here in case you want to sing at home, you know, because I know that's what you do. You go home and practice your vocal music. There was a rich lady lived over the sea, and she was an island queen. Her daughter lived off in the new country, with an ocean of water between, with an ocean of water between. There you go. There's your reminder, and you have the rest of the music you can do at home. Well, the British are fully incensed by this point. Oh dear. Oh bother. Those colonials have gone and done it. They've destroyed this lovely tea. Oh bollocks. We must punish them, and punish them good. So they passed the Coercive, otherwise known as Intolerable Acts in 1774 to punish the Bostonians. Boston will be closed until they pay back all of the expense of the tea they destroyed. So Boston's closed for business. Can't go to Boston. Boston and other colonies will be home to soldiers who are now going to be quartered, meaning housed, among civilians at civilians' own expense. So you could be having a bunch of soldiers camp out with you at home because you've been naughty colonists and you need a good, proper thrashing. The Coercive Acts also included the Administration of Justice Act, which allowed British soldiers and British officials accused of any crime in the colonies to be tried somewhere else, meaning a local jury in Boston or anywhere else is not going to be there to see these guys convicted of their crimes. Probably easier to get off if you move your trial to, say, London. The Massachusetts Government Act took away the self-governing privileges of the people of Massachusetts, told them that they could only have one town meeting per year. So they could do all their town meeting business once a year. Finally, it's not part of the actual Coercive Acts, but it's passed at the same time, and it's sort of like the, holy shnikey, what can the British do to us even more? And that was the Quebec Act, which basically allowed all of the French living in the Quebec area to practice their Catholicism. And, oh, guess what? We're going to add Ohio to this Quebec territory. So surrounding the British colonies is going to now be this ring of Catholics. And Catholics are deeply despised in colonial America. Catholics are seen as a threat. They're seen as satanic. They're seen as dangerous. So now you're going to have Catholics behind you, British quartering troops in your house. You can't govern yourselves. You can't open your Boston port for business. Freedom has gone out the window. And here's a map just to show you. This is the area that would have created the Quebec Act. All of this would become open to those horrible Catholics. As this cartoonist suggested, America was essentially being attacked by the British. America is being forced to drink tea. Boston is being cannonaded. A British man is rather lewdly looking up America's skirt while she's being restrained under military law. This is a horrific situation for America. Colonists gather together in 1774 to decide what to do about it. How are they going to respond? They agreed when they met in Philadelphia in that year that they would not import British goods. They would continue to punish the British by not buying their products. They agreed that the colonies had a right to be represented in English government and a right to make rules for themselves. They did, however, say they still wanted to be part of the British Empire. They wanted to continue to be a part of the British world. So they don't want to leave. This is not an independence movement. They create an association. That sounds rather ominous. An association to enforce anti-English trade sanctions. So don't violate the association. You could get a visit from the associators who will remind you you need to associate for the good of the colonies and not violate the association. By the next year, there is actual open conflict between the British and the Americans. Lexington happens April 19, 1775. It's a disaster for the colonists. The British pretty much scatter the colonies. The colonists sort of are like, we don't know what to do. It's chaotic and a mess. So now the question is, should we stay or should we go now? Should the colonies leave? Do they want independence? Do they want freedom? Well, about 1/5 of the Americans really still favor and love England, and they can't imagine being separated from England. This is 500,000 people in the colonies who really do want to stay with Britain. They see British law as wonderful. They appreciate British liberties. They appreciate being British. They love all things British. They don't particularly like the taxes, but they're also a little bit concerned about radicals. They think the radicals have pushed the radicalness too far. They've tarred and feathered one too many people. They've been a little too violent, a little too dangerous. Many of these loyalists are colonial officials, so they have their jobs because of the British monarchy. Many of them are Northern Anglican clergymen, so they serve in the British church, and they just feel really strong ties to England. You can see from this map here, most of the loyalists are going to tend to be coastal peoples in the big cities like Philly, New York, Norfolk, Wilmington, Charlestown. You don't see loyalists very much on the interior for the most part.